Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, discussing how to save the Great Barrier Reef. 30 years ago, experts predicted that U.S. coral reefs would be doomed by the year 2000. And a few months ago, the Sydney Morning Herald announced that the Great Barrier Reef is all but doomed, with 99% of the coral at risk. 2 weeks ago, Australia's special envoy to the reef said that Australia must dramatically increase its action on climate change to protect the Great Barrier Reef. According to the leading experts, the only hope for Australia's Great Barrier Reef is for the country to reduce its carbon emissions to zero. So let's take a look at the official data from the Australian government about the health of the Great Barrier Reef. The northern part of the reef has nearly doubled in size over the past 5 years, and there's more coral there now than there was in 1986. The southern part of the reef has tripled in size over the last 10 years, and there's about as much coral there now as there was in 1986. The central part of the reef has more than doubled in size over the past 10 years, and there's a lot more coral now than there was in 1986. The reef is doing very well and growing very quickly, so why are the newspapers claiming that the reef is doomed? A few years ago, James Cook University researcher Peter Ridd was fired for telling the truth about the Great Barrier Reef. In academia, you're simply not allowed to tell the truth about anything related to climate. The Australian courts ruled that his firing was illegal and awarded him $1.2 million in damages. All that Peter Ridd was saying was exactly what we can see from the official Australian government website. I was supposed to go on a speaking tour of Australia with Senator Malcolm Roberts and Peter Ridd during the summer of 2020. But the Australian government determined that everyone who lives outside of Australia carries some sort of lethal virus and wouldn't allow me into the country. Given that the Great Barrier Reef is growing very quickly, why is the Australian government still claiming they need to increase their action on climate change in order to save the reef? 30 years ago, governments and green groups started holding tropical boondoggles they called climate meetings. And at their tropical boondoggles, they would come up with something they called a climate agreement. None of their agreements ever had any impact on the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Governments have demonstrated over and over again that they can't control the growth of carbon dioxide, and they certainly don't have any impact on the climate. Let's finish this video up with some actual science. Corals evolved 540 million years ago when atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were 15 times higher than now, and global temperatures were about 15 degrees Celsius warmer than they are at present. The greatest expansion of life on Earth occurred at a time when carbon dioxide levels were right at their peak. Corals have survived huge swings in temperature, including very hot periods and very cold periods when most of the Earth was covered with ice. They've proven that they're very resilient to large swings in temperature. Corals consist primarily of calcium carbonate, and the carbonate comes from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the corals grow very quickly. What would be dangerous for the corals would be low levels of carbon dioxide, not high levels. These claims being made by the press and the Australian government have nothing to do with reality. The Australian government says they want to take action to save the Great Barrier Reef. This reminds me of the words of Ronald Reagan, the most terrifying words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Nothing we hear from the press or governments about climate is based on fact. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this madness for the past 13 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at RealClimateScience.com.